Back when I was in primary school, we had a teacher that everyone hated. Mr. Hanscombe, his name was. He taught English. Mr. Hanscombe was probably about 5'5", with a ratty face and thick glasses, fat little pot belly, losing his hair on top, pretty much every genetic disadvantage you can think of, all rolled into one asshole. Damn, I hated him. I don't know if the power of being taller than 30 other human beings in one classroom went to the guy's head, but he treated us more like we were prisoners than his English students. He yelled and screamed at kids. He humiliated them. He'd put you in detention for anything he could think of. He was a nasty, nasty piece of work. He had his favourites too. Not kids he liked, but kids he particularly liked to pick on. There was an overweight boy named John Picard, for instance, and every time Hanscombe took the register, he'd call him pig arse and act like it was all a big mistake. Always made him read the part of Piggy when we studied Lord of the Flies. Then there was a girl named Mary Richards who had a lisp. Whenever there were no volunteers to read out, he'd make Mary do it every time. But the kid he loved picking on most of all was Grant. Grant was a new kid who joined us at the start of year 6. Mum told me he was a traveller, which meant he moved to lots of different places and lived in a caravan. Other kids at school had different names for him, but they'd never have said them to Grant's face. The kid was about a head taller than the rest of us for one. Big-boned and broad, he had this steely, don't mess with me look about him that meant the other kids left him well alone. It didn't stop Mr. Hanscombe though, not one bit. I don't know whether it was because Grant was almost a head taller than he was, or because Grant's family were travellers, but Hanscombe had marked him from day one. He hated Grant. You could hear it in his voice every time he spoke to him. He did not like the kid one bit. Mr. Hanscombe alternated between telling Grant off in front of everyone. This could be for literally anything, like sneezing while Hanscombe was talking or having his shirt untucked, and trying his best to embarrass the kid. The first week, he had Grant come up to the front of the class, then berated him for 10 minutes because his shoes weren't properly polished. Another time he told us we were going to practice synonyms, then wrote the word different in the middle of the blackboard. We had to take turns going up and writing words around it that meant something similar. When we were done, Mr. Hanscombe gave a thin smile. Now, we need someone well versed in this subject to volunteer to read all these words out loud to the class, he said. How about you, Grant? I think he'd been expecting Grant to be a slow reader, but he was wrong. The kid might have looked like a thug, but boy could he read. He rattled through those words with no problem at all, never giving any hint that the subject matter affected him. I could see Hanscombe's smile slowly turning to a scowl the longer it went on. Things carried on in the same vein for most of the autumn term, Hanscombe needling and Grant putting up with it as best he could. Then, come October, we had a special assignment, one for Halloween. The idea was to go away and write a scary story, so we could take turns reading them out loud in class on October 31st. I don't remember many of the stories the other kids told that day. I barely even remember my own. I think it was something pretty generic about a monster in the cupboard of the room. But I remember Grant's. Even all these years later, I still remember it. The story Grant told was sort of a folktale, and it had me hooked from the moment he began. Here it is, in Grant's words, as best as I can remember it. Once upon a time, there was a family of witches who lived in a cave. The witches kept to themselves, and most of the people and creatures in the nearby village left them well alone. But there was one exception. A large, ugly troll terrorized the woods surrounding the village. The troll was 8 feet tall, with a big green belly the size of a boulder. Hideous red boils and warts covered his face. He ate anything that was foolish enough to get in his way. Now, the troll thought he owned the woods, and he didn't like the fact the witches were living in a cave so close to them. He didn't like it at all. But there wasn't much he could do about it. Whenever he'd see the witches, he'd give chase, but they'd always run back into the safety of their cave. They'd crawl back into the darkness between the rocks, and the troll was too big to follow them. He'd stand at the mouth of the cave, and he'd bellow the same thing every day. "Witches hiding in the cracks. Leave this land and don't come back. If you refuse and choose to stay, I know that I will make you pay." Now, the witches were afraid of the troll. Everyone was, but they didn't have anywhere else to go. So for a long time, they survived as best they could. They'd sneak out of the cave to get food, and to fetch the items they'd use to brew their spells, whenever the troll was out of sight. And whenever they saw him, they'd run back into the darkness. The troll was never smart enough to catch him, and he got angrier and angrier. Soon, he started killing animals and leaving them to rot in the mouth of the cave. Badgers, foxes, birds. One day, he even caught a child from the nearby village and left his tiny, broken body in the cave's entrance. When the witches came out the next day and saw this, they were horrified. But they also spotted something else. Something the troll would never have noticed. Stuck among the blood and broken remains of the body was one thick, black hair. A hair from the head of the troll. And when the witches saw this, they finally knew what to do. They took the hair and they gathered up some twigs from the forest and they wove it all together into a miniature wooden doll. They made it tall and fat and ugly, so it looked as much like the troll as possible. Then they gathered around it in a circle to cast their spell. And when they were finished with their magic, they got the doll and took turns sticking pins in it. Pin after pin after pin. By the time they were finished, the thing had over 100 sharp sticks of metal peppering its wooden body. The next day, there was no dead animal outside their cave. There was no sign of the troll at all. The witches went looking for it in the forest, and soon enough, they found some black troll's blood staining the ferns by the river. They followed the trail. The blood got thicker the further along they went, and the stains grew more and more frequent, fresher. Finally, in a clearing not far from the village, they found the troll itself. It was slumped in the shade of a giant oak tree, eyes closed, pulling in shallow breath after shallow breath. And it was bleeding from 100 tiny mouths that had been carved into its green flesh, its black blood leaching out of it in the most slow and painful way imaginable. I remember Mr. Hanscombe stopping the story at this point. He had a familiar scowl on his face as he gestured for the class to be silent. You could tell everyone had been into the story, because a bunch of kids groaned when Hanscombe put a stop to it. Yes, okay, he said, holding his hand up for a while. I think we've heard enough, Grant. That was predictably unpleasant. I suppose you can take the boy out of the caravan, but you can never quite take the caravan out of the boy. That wasn't the last day I saw Grant, but it must have been close. He left our school a couple of weeks later. Family moved away. I heard they went further south, but no one really knew for sure. All we knew was that one day Grant was in lessons, and the next day his chair was empty. Gone. Just like that. And a few days later, so was Mr. Hanscombe. It started when a supply teacher appeared one morning to take his English class. We didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed he was sick or something. That was until we saw the front page of the next day's newspaper. We never found out all the details. There was talk from the headmaster and whispers in the playground, sure, but mainly just a lot of rumours. No one quite knew what to believe. The one thing everyone could agree on was that Mr. Hanscombe. The police had no leads, and the details of his death were apparently too grim for the paper to print. I don't know what it was that drove me to go looking for the spot where Grant's family had been camping. Simple curiosity, perhaps. Maybe the fact I couldn't quite shake the memory of the story he'd told. Whatever it was, I spent the weeks after Hanscombe's murder riding my bike around the local countryside after school and at weekends, trying to track down their old campsite. And eventually, I found it. It was a man who worked at a newsagent on the edge of a nearby village that gave me the tip, pointed me in the direction of some fields alongside a forest, said the travellers had been staying somewhere over that way. It didn't take me long to find the right field after that. It was close to the edge of the woods, not that far from the river. Reminded me a bit of the setting in the story Grant had told. Just swap the cave for a field. I set my bike down and began looking around. Grant's family had been gone a few weeks by then, but the signs were still there. Flattened patches of grass, a couple of rusted metal chairs, cigarette butts, and, in what I guess must have been the middle of their campsite, a stone circle. I don't know why, but I had a funny feeling in my stomach as I approached that circle. Butterflies, I suppose. Maybe a little fear. The stone circle was empty, but for one thing in the middle. A tiny shape, propped up against the rock. I think my mind knew what I was going to see a second before I got close enough to make it out in detail. I drew in a sharp breath. The object leaning against the rock was a doll. Wooden, painted, carved out of some nearby tree was my guess. The doll was small, but had been decorated with careful detail. A little potbelly, thinning hair. I recognized Mr. Hanscombe almost immediately. There was one thing different. Only one thing that separated the likeness of the doll from the image of Mr. Hanscombe that had appeared in the local paper. Something subtly wrong with the face. I leaned closer to get a better look and felt a wave of nausea roll through my stomach. Both of the doll's eyes had been gouged out. Everyone loves Walt Disney. His stories and animations have warmed the hearts of countless audiences around the world for generations. That's the side of him they wanted you to see. I worked 3 years in Burbank, California as a digital archivist for the Walt Disney Company. I can't give my name here because just me writing this is breaking half a dozen NDAs that they made me sign before I was, quote, let go from the company. My job was to oversee conversions and restoration of film prints into digital format. Because there was rarely anything new to come out of the vault, I found the majority of my time on the clock doing digital cleanups of repertory titles. They'd make us huddle over already sifted through footage to pick specks of dirt from films like Cinderella or Snow White. That was so when people bought yet another re-release on Blu-ray, they'd think they were getting their money's worth. That all changed when I heard that half a dozen film canisters had been discovered in the basement of one of Disney's many vacation properties. There were 13 canisters, all of them labelled with their titles. The majority were old, unseen Mickey Mouse shorts, nothing new or original. One of the canisters, however, was unmarked. I ran the film through the projector. The year 1944 appeared on the screen, then a title that read, Walt Disney's The Final Solution. What followed was a beautifully animated cartoon in full colour and sound. The animation was unlike anything Disney had ever made before or after. Instead of cartoonish characters with comically exaggerated features, I was looking at near photorealistic renderings moving with lifelike fluidity. There was no music, only a low humming sound that almost played melodically in unison with the images. I can remember every frame of the cartoon like it was just yesterday. The story was about a man named Dr. Disney. He was a scientist working for the government who had come to a drastic conclusion. Mankind was a sickness, a pox on the planet, a hateful parasite that could never be cured of its own shortcomings. After an unauthorized experiment involving 2 fully confiscated chipmunks, the doctor was court-martialed and publicly shamed for his extreme scientific methods. Alone, broken, and on the cusp of poverty, the doctor would soon be approached by a Russian spy who'd explained that over the years the KGB had been spying on him, the doctor's scientific achievements being the subject of much study in Russia. The cartoon continues with the Russians secretly bankrolling the doctor, allowing him to continue his experiments in a hidden, underground laboratory containing the most cutting-edge technology. This was all under the strict conditions that his completed work would be the property of the Soviets. Deep in the laboratory, the doctor began steps that, when finished, would change the unsuspecting world above him forever. The doctor meticulously crafted his perfect creation, manipulating the DNA of a common mouse into a 5-foot, upright-standing vessel of sentience. The doctor would name this metaphorical Adam. Mickey would be the first of a new race that would one day replace humans as the stewards of Earth. Walt would affectionately dub these new beings anthropomorphs. In the following weeks, Mickey would learn and comprehend at a near impossible rate. Mickey would eventually utilize this newfound intelligence to assist the doctor in the creation of 2 more anthropomorphs, a duck that would be named Donald and a dog that would be named Goofy. The doctor would pass his moral values onto the trio, constantly teaching Mickey, Donald and Goofy about the folly of man and how it could all be changed for the better. The doctor would keep his creations hidden from the Russian higher-ups, buying time by telling the KGB he was working on a bioweapon codenamed Fantasia that, when used, would wipe out not only the Americans but anyone else that didn't respect the best interest of the Soviet Union. This weapon, as he continued to explain, would carry on the winds, travel around the entire world, killing those not inoculated with the cure. The doctor then delivers the Russians both the superweapon Fantasia, as well as the means to administer the cure to every man, woman and child that the Russians deemed worthy of saving. The Russians deploy the doctor's doomsday weapon, Fantasia, spreads around the globe, killing billions in a matter of days, including the Russians themselves. The cure the doctor claimed to develop never existed. The human race is soon erased from existence. It's revealed that Fantasia would have a secondary purpose. While deadly to humans, the compound would mutate all animals that came into direct contact. Anthropomorphs are now the dominant species on the planet. This is shown in a montage that plays like something from a horror movie due to the animation's realism. Deep in the underground lab, the doctor is isolated from the effects of Fantasia. He spends his final moments with Mickey saying, "Remember what I've taught you. When I'm gone, they'll look to you for leadership. All of them. Learn from our mistakes so that you never make them yourselves." Mickey is confused. thinking that the doctor would see this new world he was responsible for creating. The doctor tells the saddened Mickey that he has no place in the world because it no longer belongs to him. After an emotional goodbye to his protégés, Mickey, Donald and Goofy know what must be done. Using their enhanced strength, they rip the doctor to bloody shreds, then take turns consuming the gory chunks to acquire the last of his wisdom. Mickey, Goofy and Donald escape to the surface, where they are surrounded by hundreds of newly turned anthropomorphs. They're lost, they're confused, they're scared. Mickey tells them not to fear as he takes his place as shepherd to this new flock that's looking for guidance. We see a montage of society being reborn. Mickey is declared leader of Disney World. Donald and Goofy take their places in Mickey's side as his council. The anthropomorphs assume control over the already established human infrastructure, using their shared intelligence to improve in technology once thought to be on the fringes of cutting edge. Even in this age of enlightenment, the anthropomorphs regard Dr. Disney with reverence of a god. A religion is formed based on what was able to be pieced together from his past. They erect monuments, statues, and churches to worship the man who gave them all life. The effects of Fantasia are not without their drawbacks. While most animal species on the planet have evolved, there are those who have a genetic resistance to the change. This 20% of the animal population lives in harmony with their biologically advanced kin. They are named the Elder Ones. Some continue to live in the wild, others live as pets. The cartoon finally ends with Mickey taking in one of these animals, a familiar orange dog. The end fades up on the screen as Mickey and Pluto walk off into the sunset. I was oblivious to the fact that my nose had been bleeding continuously as I watched the cartoon. Seconds later, the room started spinning, and everything went black. When I came to, the lab was in ruins. Machines were smashed and streaks of blood stained the walls. Looking down at my trembling hands, I could see that they were covered in deep gashes. Not long after waking up, I would be escorted off the premises by security. I was let go soon after for sabotaging company property. It was very formal and they chose not to press charges. The blackouts would continue for months after my termination. When I eventually did go to the hospital, they discovered that I have stage 4 brain cancer. I know with every fibre of my being that I'm now sick from watching that cartoon. The doctors say I don't have that long left, that I should make the best of my remaining time. I wish I could. I really do. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw that night. I can't stop wondering what Disney originally planned to do with that cartoon. I hope to God that they destroy it, because I know now, in these final moments of my life, that cartoon wasn't named the final solution. It was the final solution. I was 8 when my brother Josh died. I remember it vividly even now. Every little detail from when we woke up until his very last breath. He was 2 years older than me, and we would fight non-stop, like most siblings do. That day was no different. We got up early before our parents did, and raced down the stairs. He beat me like he always did, and as a reward, he got the last bowl of cereal. I was so mad at him for that. After we had finished breakfast, we ran outside to play. It was a warm summer morning, and I can still imagine that wall of heat hitting me as I opened the front door. We played for hours without pause, and it remains one of the best memories I have of him. He died around noon. A long drop, a crunch, and a snap. It all happened so fast. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the pond of blood grew and listened intently as his final, wheezing breath left his broken body. Shock, my parents said. I was in shock. They couldn't get me to speak for weeks. I observed when the ambulance arrived, the paramedics and the firemen running around shouting hysterically. Then, the sirens dying out in the distance. My mom and dad left sobbing inconsolably. I stood, silent, as the funeral came. I held my breath as they lowered the coffin into the awaiting depths, and only after I saw the headstone loom before me could I allow myself to talk again. We moved shortly after the funeral. My mom could no longer stand living in the house. My dad reluctantly agreed, but kept telling her that they would be losing money on the sale. Mom didn't care. No amount of money could have persuaded her to stay, to live on the property that stole her Josh from her. I knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. The new house was quite a bit smaller than the old one, but I liked it. It was cozy and sweet, and had sort of an old cottage vibe to it. And even though I missed Josh, I was happy to have a bedroom to call my own, to decorate as my own, to grow up in. Days, weeks, and months passed, and not much changed. There was an aura of gloom about the family, a lingering grief that wouldn't quite let go. It was like the days just faded into nothing, like none of us really were there. Originally, I thought that was the reason it came. It was drawn to our grief, to our constant, ever-present sorrow. The first time it came from the walls was 3 months after Josh's death. It was a day like all the others, grey and uneventful, and I had drifted off to sleep later than usual. My body maybe somehow aware that there was something unnatural nearby. I awoke in the darkness by an unidentifiable sound, somehow coming from all the walls at once. It was sort of a soft clicking sound, rising in pitch, then lowering again. I never heard anything quite like it, and I sat up in bed, squinting, trying to make out where it could originate from. After a few minutes, my eyes were slowly adjusting to the darkness, and my gaze was drawn to a hole in the wall. It was just a tiny knothole, maybe an inch or two, but for some reason, I was convinced it was the source of the sound. I sat there for minutes, trembling, just staring into the hole, not knowing why. Then I noticed it started widening, yet inexplicably remaining the same size. I crept under my sheets in fear when the head squeezed through. I just lay there, frozen, unable to move or make a sound. I could hear it moving around out there, like it was exploring, searching. I must have stayed under the sheets for hours before I finally just passed out. The next morning, I jolted awake with a scream and immediately ran to tell my parents about it. They dismissed it, of course. Just some vivid dream caused by an overactive imagination, they were sure. I tried to reason with them, but soon just gave up. They just wouldn't listen. This kept happening for weeks. I would wake up to the soft clicking sound, stare at the hole, and hide under my sheets when I saw the head emerge. I could never get a good look at it. I was far too frightened, but it was completely bald, and the skin had an ashen grey complexion to it. I could never really judge the dimensions of it because of the impossible nature of its arrival. I would plead to my parents to just believe me, or let me sleep with them, or simply just explore the knothole, or tear down the walls. But they would dismiss me every time, usually just telling me I was being childish, that it was all just a nightmare, and that it would eventually stop. One night, I decided I wasn't going to hide anymore. I was going to face the thing that came from the walls, figure out what it wanted. I was terrified, but resolute. I woke up like all the other nights, listening intently to that eerie clicking sound, staring at the knothole with absolute concentration, swallowing deeply as the hole started to widen, and choking back my fear when the appalling head squeezed through. It landed on the ground with a thump, and I stared in horror as the tiny, underdeveloped body writhed on the floor, struggling with the weight of its oversized head. I let out a scream then. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The creature raised its head strenuously, like an alerted animal, and stared directly at me. There was holes. Nothing but holes. The mouth was a yawning chasm of nothing, the nose and eyes the same, just endless abyssal rifts. I screamed again, this time probably loud enough to wake up the entire neighbourhood. My mom says she still has nightmares about that scream, and she'll easily admit it froze her blood to ice. My parents came rushing into the room in a hysterical frenzy, only to find me alone, curled up on the floor in a fetal position, screaming my lungs out. It took them hours to calm me down, and they said I only spoke nonsensical gibberish. They took me to my aunt's for a few days, but eventually I was forced to sleep in my own room again. The ritual continued. I woke up, stared at the hole until the head emerged, then hid under my sheets for the remainder of my conscious night. I was slowly but surely getting used to it. I'd still tell my parents about it, but they still wouldn't believe me. I know it sounds horrible, but you have to understand, they were still dealing with the death of Josh. They simply had no energy to indulge my self-induced traumas. But at some point, I got too used to it. I simply stopped waking up. The sound no longer bothered me, and I would just sleep through it. Problem solved, right? I certainly thought so. Until I woke up one night with a thing on top of me, staring me right in the face. Those endless, abyssal eyes swirling away, that gaping chasm of a mouth hovering inches above. I was too mortified to scream, my body now somehow unable to move at all. As an adult, I could have simply written it off to some extreme form of sleep paralysis, if it wasn't for the next part. Foul-smelling, black liquid started pouring from the creature's orifices, completely covering, drowning my face in it. My mouth was filling with the awfulness of it, and at some point I swallowed some, just to catch my breath. The taste was that of death, of decay and rot. I was panicking, desperately trying to move, scream, do anything at all, but I couldn't. I was trapped, and sooner or later, I just passed out. I woke up in a pond of the black liquid. I showed my parents the foul stuff and explained what had happened. My dad said they'd seen some signs of leakage around the house, so it must have been that. Just some stale, putrid water seeping through the roof. I resigned then from ever asking them anything again. They simply couldn't be trusted. We moved a couple of years later. I would see the creature every night, but made sure to set an alarm so that I never had to wake up to that horrible creature's face ever again. But now I was free, I thought happily. We were getting along better as a family, and we were finally moving away from that cursed place. And for months, I felt wonderful. I had a semblance of life again, of freedom, of joy. But then one night, I woke up to the soft sound of clicking. I sat up and scanned the walls, and there it was. A tiny knothole and a head squeezing through it. Moving didn't help at all. The creature followed me wherever I went. I'd be free for a couple of months tops, then I would wake up to that sound and a head. Every once in a while, I would sleep through it and wake up with that ashen grey face inches from my own. The liquid would pour and I would swallow. Then I'd wake up in a pond with no one there to believe me. I grew up depressed, stressed, unhinged, half mad. Somehow I made it through school, college, even got a job. But I would never feel good. I could never feel joy. I could never connect with another human being ever again. The creature wouldn't let me. It slowly drained my life from me. When I was 25, my doctor told me my physiological age was that of a 50-year-old. Start exercising, he said. One day, 3 years ago, I went back to the place it all started. I'd known for years already, maybe even always, what caused it, what brought it to me, what it was. But I could never take it in, never admit to it, never confess. And that was always the reason for my punishment. I stood by the gaping chasm of the abandoned, dried-up well where Josh had fallen in, staring into the depths. I remember every moment of that day, every detail vividly. I remember playing hide and seek. I remember hiding behind the garage. I remember seeing Josh looking for me around the well. He stood so close, so dangerously close. Then I remember how mad I was at him for eating the last of the cereal. And I remember creeping up behind him and pushing him with all of my might. Then an endlessly long drop, a loud crunch, a blood-curdling snap. "I'm sorry, Josh," I said then. "I didn't mean to do it. I thought it was just water." But his vengeance is endless. Endless like that drop. Endless like the black of that creature's eyes. Endless like my suffering. I will go to sleep tonight, every night, forever, and it will come from the walls. Ever since live webcam feeds became popular, I've been a big fan of them. It's strangely relaxing to watch them. I'm not talking about streamers on Twitch or other pages like that. I'm talking about live feeds of public places. By now, there are millions of them out there. You can watch a public square in the center of Tokyo, switch to a small town in Eastern Europe, and after, look at a busy street in the US. What I was most interested in, though, were the feeds of my own city. I often sat in front of my computer, wondering what other people were up to at the exact same moment. How many people were sitting together with friends and family? How many were alone? How many people were born? And how many died at this exact moment? These questions often lingered in the back of my head. These feeds helped me satisfy my curiosity, at least to a degree. It wasn't long, though, before I was tired of the normal feeds. In the end, it was nothing but watching public places and open spaces. I wanted something different, something more intimate. It was right here on Reddit that I stumbled upon a different type of feed. I didn't know they existed, but there are thousands of hacked webcams and compromised security cameras out there. Nowadays, everything's digitized. Most people have a webcam at home. It was satisfying to watch people in secret. You could simply tune into someone else's life and see raw, unfiltered events. I could see the dreadfully boring atmosphere in an open office space or watch a happy family of 3 playing a board game. All of those were only mildly interesting, though. Once I started to dig, however, I eventually stumbled upon things that were a bit stranger. One feed was from an office in my city. The walls were plastered with motivational pictures and Far Eastern dogmas. The moment I opened the feed, a strange productivity ritual was going on. There was no sound, of course, but watching a dozen people move in unison as if in a trance was creepy enough. Another feed showed me an old man in a wheelchair. For a while, the man was going through a book, but then a young woman entered the room. She was wearing a nursing outfit and brought a bucket into the room with her. She filled it with water and started to wash the old man's body. The weird part began when she undressed as well and started to wash her own body in front of the man. There were many other such feeds. In one, I saw a middle-aged woman hugging a life-size doll that looked exactly like her. Another one showed a family in a perpetual argument, screaming at each other and behaving like rabid animals. What made things even worse was the integrated chat function. If you tuned into one of those compromised feeds, you'd automatically join a chat. People in there were going livid, poking fun and laughing about the miserable lives of others. I'd like to tell you that I was disgusted by this, but to be honest, I was fascinated. The people on screen, the chat, my own emotions, it all came together into a weird, strange mix that made me feel alive. I longed to peek into people's private lives, to see what was below the mask. I searched for feeds that allowed me to satisfy my own voyeuristic tendencies. At first, I'd switched through these feeds randomly. Soon enough, though, I reverted back to my old habit. I started searching for feeds in my city specifically. Most of the feeds I found had specific names. I guess it had to do with the setup. As I went through the list, I saw Security Camera 1A, Lobby 21C, Bedroom, My Home 2, and so on. When I stumbled upon one that consisted of nothing but numbers and letters, my interest was piqued. The preview was nothing but a dark screen. I clicked it and was greeted by complete darkness. At first I frowned and thought the camera might be broken. Then I noticed something moving in the dark. I tried my best to figure out what it was, but it was too damn dark to see anything. Was the camera indoors or outside? Frustrated, I was about to close the feed off, but then I saw more movement. I cursed and leaned forward, trying to figure out what I was watching. Suddenly, a floodlight came on, and for a moment I cringed back. When I looked at the screen again, I saw that the broadcast came from a vast hall. No, I realized when I saw the empty shelves that lined the walls. A warehouse. The camera had been situated in one of the upper corners to allow a view of the whole area. As I watched, I saw people walking around. Was this the security camera of some warehouse? Was I watching a night shift or something? When more people came into view, I realized that couldn't be it. No one would need a dozen people to take care of a warehouse, let alone multiple dozen. As I continued to watch, I saw that there had to be at least 50 people there. Some were dressed in casual clothes, others were wearing more expensive outfits. Had I stumbled upon a private party? Or hell, maybe this was a secret meetup. In my mind, ideas about underground society and secret cults formed. Then I laughed out loud. This was real life, not Hollywood. It was probably nothing remotely like what I'd imagined. Hell, it might be a startup that had bought this old warehouse and planned to transform it into a makeshift office or something equally dull. Still, I told myself I'd watch for a bit longer. When I saw people dressed up like security guards, I watched with more interest. They seemed to talk to one of the more costly dressed people and soon vanished again, off camera. Then, people looked up to somewhere else that I couldn't see. I cursed. These damn feeds never had any damn audio. I wanted to hear what was going on, for goodness sake. What is this crap? someone typed into the chat next to the camera feed. I always ignored chat. I really didn't want to interact with anyone. When I checked it out, I saw that 3 other people were watching the feed with me. Illuminati, someone else answered. Yep, that's precisely why I didn't associate with these people. As they continued to talk about what the Illuminati planned to do at an abandoned warehouse in a random city, I continued to watch the feed. Right now, a new figure came into view. He walked between the assembled people who formed a circle around him. The man was holding a microphone and addressed everyone present. Must be a party after all, I thought. Suddenly, there was movement from outside the circle. 2 of the security guards moved towards it, dragging a third man behind them. He was struggling in their grip, trying to get away. Alright, what the hell was I watching? The man was thrown into the middle of the circle. He looked around, visibly agitated, and seemed to yell at the attendees. Many times he tried to break from the circle, but each time the security guards stopped him. As I watched the man's desperate attempt at escape, I almost missed the other figure who walked towards the circle. The moment I noticed him, though, I could not look away anymore. This guy was tall. Unnaturally tall. He seemed to be at least a head taller than everyone else. The camera was a bit too far away, so at first I thought he was wearing a mask. When he opened his mouth, though, I realized that this had to be his real face. There was only the hint of a nose between scar tissue, and his mouth seemed almost lipless. His arms were massive, bulking with muscle, and ended in hands the size of bear paws. What the hell was this guy? People in chat went wild when they saw him. I read the word mutant, super soldier, and even a reference to Resident Evil. I frowned. The moment the man reached the circle, the attendees hurried out of his way to let him pass. When the other man saw this hulking abomination, he tried to escape once more, but it was futile. By now, all the attendees seemed to be in a state of utter excitement. The man with the microphone first turned towards the smaller man who tried to escape. Then he turned to the freak show of a man that had just entered the circle. He nodded at both of them before he turned around and joined the rest of the attendees in the circle. People were applauding and yelling, and I finally realized what I was watching. This was a fight. A pit fight, to be precise. Freak Show, the name I'd given to the abomination, stepped forward. With no more than a few steps, he'd crossed the distance between himself and the other man. The man reacted quickly and escaped to the other side of the circle. Whenever he got too close to the attendees, though, they pushed him forward to the center again. It wasn't long before Freak Show was able to grasp the man and threw him to the ground. The man got back to his feet, but a moment later, Freak Show's giant fist connected with his face. Blood exploded into the air, and the man was blown off his feet. "Oh my gosh!" I pressed out. The audience exploded into applause again. The man got up once more, but he was staggering. Then he leaned to his right. One of the audience members had handed him something. Only when he charged forward did I see that he was holding a metal rod. Freak Show raised his giant arms to protect his face, but one of the hits still connected. This sent him into a frenzy. A second hit connected as well, but there was no visible reaction. When the third blow came, Freak Show effortlessly caught the metal rod. He ripped it from the other man's hands and kicked him backwards. This time, he didn't go down, but a swing of the metal rod finished the job. Freak Show went forward and put his foot on the man's chest. I saw the small frame desperately trying to get away. Then, Freakshow took the metal rod and rammed it into the guy's face. The feed went silent, yet I could hear the man's painful screams in my head. Blood and teeth splattered over the floor. Jesus Christ, what the hell was I watching? I thought this was just some sort of fight, but this went way too far. The fight was over now, wasn't it? Like I couldn't possibly fight anymore. It wasn't over yet though. With one hand, Freakshow shoved the metal rod straight into the man's ravaged mouth. Then he raised his other hand high into the air before he brought his fist down on top of the metal rod with full force. For a few moments, the body below him was convulsing before he lay still. I sat in front of the camera, stunned. I stared at the screen, unblinking. Had I seen what I thought I had? On the feed, the man with the microphone walked back to the center of the circle. He raised Freakshow's arm up in the air, most likely proclaiming him the winner of the fight. The audience exploded into toneless cheering, while security dragged the body of the loser off camera. Had I really watched someone being murdered? Chat was slow now. Everyone must have been as shocked as I was. Is this real, guys? One person typed out. Probably a movie or something, another answered. A movie? But there was no set, no film crew, no other cameras, nothing. It all looks so damn realistic. Right at this moment, a new person entered the chat. Guess you've been watching, haven't you? No duh, someone answered. Similar comments by the remaining two followed. Well then, you know that you should at least mask your IP address and cover your own camera. Otherwise, it's really easy to figure out where you are. When I read this, I froze. I looked at the webcam on top of my monitor. I stared directly into it, as only now did I notice the tiny, green light that showed it had been active all along. In an instant, I ripped it off my computer, and moments later, I closed the strange camera feed. However, there'd been one last message. I'd only seen it for the blink of an eye, yet I'd read it. It was only two little words that drove me into a state of sheer and utter panic. Too slow. We never talked about my grandmother on my father's side. I didn't really take notice of her absence until I was about 10 or so. I've always been close with my grandparents on my mother's side, so I never really felt like I lacked anything in that department. I suppose it just hadn't occurred to me at that point that I should have two sets of grandparents. That is, until I had to do a family tree project for school, and I realized I had no idea how to fill in a few branches. When I went to my dad to ask them, he seemed reluctant to acknowledge their existence. He only gave me the bare minimum of information needed for the project, their names and a couple of old, wallet-sized photos. The only thing about these people that was familiar to me was our shared last name. Examining their photos, I felt a strange sense of dissonance when I attempted to think of them as my grandparents. When I thought of my grandparents, my mind went to kind-looking older folks, sage advice, and the occasional fresh-baked cookie. When I looked at these people, I felt none of that warmth. They seemed oddly severe, both of them wearing a frown in their photos. The man seemed shriveled and wiry and carried a sense of hollowness in his gaze. The woman was a tad bit plump and wore a flowery dress. Her eyes were small and somewhat beady, carrying nothing in the way of kindness. They looked like the people I'd seen photos from the Great Depression. When I tried to ask Dad about them, he refused to say anything more on the subject. He seemed almost angry with me for trying to ask him, just barely restraining himself from yelling, so I didn't attempt to press him further. Eventually, my young mind wandered off to other things, and I soon forgot about them, for the most part. It wasn't until I was 15 that I heard mention of them again, at which point I would have the displeasure of meeting my grandmother. My dad received a strange letter in the mail one day. The paper was so yellowed with age that it looked like it could have been in transit for over 30 years, yet it apparently had only been posted a few days prior. I would eventually learn that it was from my grandmother, and that she was notifying us of and inviting us to the funeral of her husband, my grandfather. My parents fought for some time on whether or not to go. The first time I'd ever actually seen or heard them do so. My dad, strangely enough, wanted to go, and my mum was trying to convince him otherwise. I didn't hear a lot of what was said, given that most of the fight took place in their bedroom, but from what I could tell, she was very concerned about whether or not seeing her would be good for his mental well-being. Eventually, though, they settled on going, and I was to come along as well. The event itself was unremarkable. It was at a small church about a 6-hour drive away, in a small town that I had never been to or heard of. I didn't recognize anyone there, and I could barely recognize the man in the coffin as the same person I'd seen in the photo all those years ago. I felt incredibly awkward being there, and mostly ended up simply following my parents around as they had brief, polite conversations with some of the other attendees. I smelled my grandmother before I saw her. The odour I suddenly caught wind of from amidst the crowd of people made me think that perhaps there was another improperly embalmed dead body there, which someone had left sitting in a pool of its own excrement. I clutched at my nose, trying in vain to block out the smell. I wasn't the only one either, as my parents and many people around us were doing the same, though managing to be a bit more discreet about it. People didn't seem concerned about where the smell was coming from. They more so seemed determined to not acknowledge it. That confused me for a bit, until the crowd happened to part slightly, and I finally saw her. She sat in a broken down looking hover-round. The sheer girth of her obscene obesity barely contained within it. I have never been the type to judge a person based off their weight, but the sheer size of this woman spoke of an excess that was not reasonable in any regard. Even that, however, was overshadowed by her apparent complete disregard for any semblance of personal hygiene. The dress she wore may have been nice at one point, but was now nothing but a cacophony of stains, pulled taut over countless rolls of skin. I couldn't tell for sure, but it almost seemed to be the same one I had seen her wearing in the photo. Her hair hung grey and stringy, noticeably thinning around the top of her head. Her face was pockmarked, greasy, and clearly unwashed, a half-hearted attempt at makeup already beginning to drip downwards like some sort of oil slick. It was immediately apparent that she was the source of the smell. It took me a moment to realise that this was my grandmother, as she looked only vaguely similar to the slightly plump older woman I had seen in the photo. My parents were just as shocked as I was. Dad stood frozen, simply staring blankly, and Mom's jaw hung slightly agape. My grandmother noticed our gazes then, turning the struggling hover around slightly to face us, her eyes fixed on us, beady, black, and oddly small in her face. The rest of her appearance repulsed me, sure, but something about those eyes made me feel an instinctual fear. It was less like I was looking at a morbidly obese elderly woman, and more like I was staring down a great white shark poised to bite me in half. Our gazes met then. She smiled, revealing 2 rows of black, rotten teeth. Neither my parents or I were particularly comfortable staying long after that, and we soon left. Once in the car, my parents briefly commented on how different my grandmother looked now, before ultimately falling silent once more as we pulled out of the gravel parking lot. It was a tenuous sort of silence, like there was a great weight of things going unsaid. I didn't press either of them with questions though, remembering how Dad had reacted last time. Eventually, after some time, Dad began to speak. It was less of a conversation and more of an unloading of a mass of things he had kept from me all these years. I didn't dare interrupt to ask him any questions, afraid that if I interrupted him, it would dam up the stream again. His upbringing had been relatively normal at first. His parents are your typical stern Catholics, strict, but not unkind. They were happy for the most part. However, around his 14th birthday, something changed. Something inside his mother, my grandmother, broke all of a sudden. It was like somewhere, deep at the core of her being, there was this massive pustule that contained the sum of all vile things associated with the human condition, and one day, it just burst, staining the entirety of her person with its evil. She became cruel, violent, and abusive, striking out at both her husband and son in vicious fits of rage. It would have been easier if she had gone completely off the rails, but she retained some measure of her sanity, enough to be clever and calculating, and managed to hide her sudden change from anyone outside of the family. His father, my grandfather, a weak-willed man, meek sort of man, tried his best to defend his son, but failed to do so in the end. Eventually, he developed into a passive onlooker, too busy self-medicating with drugs and alcohol to resist against his changed wife. Things escalated over time, and Dad eventually left home at 17 after my grandmother nearly bit off 3 of his fingers on his right hand, leaving him with permanent nerve damage. He and my grandmother have never reconciled or spoken since, and the records of the incident taken from his visit to the hospital following it were enough for a restraining order to be filed. He left town, moving to the city, and never looked back. Eventually, he met my mother at 19, and they started dating and then married. He still resented my grandfather, even now, for not protecting him from my grandmother, though he regretted cutting off all contact with him as well, basically abandoning him with her. This lingering regret is why he felt obligated to come to his funeral on some level. I asked only one question. Why didn't either he or his father try to get her into some sort of psychiatric treatment or facility when there was so very clearly something wrong with her? He told me there were many reasons for this. His dad's negligence, his own status as a minor, the failure of how hospitals at the time handled mental illness, and the mindset of a small religious town all contributed to where things ended up. However, he acknowledged that if he had stuck around, perhaps he could have maybe eventually got her the treatment she needed. But on this, he had only one thing to say. You could devote your entire life to curing cancer. You could work yourself to the bone, tear your life to shreds, and sacrifice everything just to cure the disease. However, in spite of it all, the best solution will sometimes be to just cut the tumor out. I wouldn't hear anything more about my grandmother for another 10 years after this, when, all of a sudden, I received a letter of my own. There was nothing to indicate outwardly that the letter was about her. It was in a crisp, clean envelope that looked nothing like the ancient piece of mail that my father had received. It wasn't from an address I recognized, and was apparently from a lawyer that I had never heard of who operated out of a town I had never been to. Perplexed, and having no idea what the piece of mail could possibly be about, I simply opened and read the thing. What I found inside seemed to come completely out of left field. My grandmother had passed away a few days ago, and I had been named the sole beneficiary in her will. Essentially, the purpose of the letter was to inform me of this, and to ask me to visit the lawyer at his office to discuss the details. I wasn't sure how to take any of it, honestly. Why name me, someone she had never had any semblance of a relationship with, as a sole beneficiary? Why not my father, or somebody she actually knew? I couldn't come to a conclusion at the time, lacking any sort of information to go off of, so I simply decided to go and talk with the lawyer, hoping that her reasons would simply illuminate themselves. I wish now that I had simply ignored it all. This inheritance of hers has given me nothing but trouble and trauma. I figured that leaving it all to me was just some sort of sick joke on her part, a way of cruelly lashing out at us one last time. She's dead now, so who knows for sure? Either way, I hope she burns in hell, the damn witch. The meeting with the lawyer was brief, but informative. Basically, I was left to make sense of the mess she had left behind. If I preferred, I could relinquish my rights to her assets, property and such, but he recommended that I at least inspect the property first to determine if there was anything of personal value to either me or my father that I may want. He did stress, though, that there was likely nothing of any sort of monetary value to be claimed, as my grandmother had been quite destitute at the time of her passing. Ultimately, I decided to at least pay a visit to the property in question, a small house in the middle of the woods. I figured, if anything, I should do it for the sake of my father. He had left his entire childhood behind him when he had to run away from her. I figured now was my chance to take some of it back for him. As such, after our brief meeting, the lawyer and I went to the property to examine it together. It was about an hour's drive away from the lawyer's office, just outside of the little town I had visited during the funeral. It was a small, ranch-style house at the end of a series of dirt roads that led aimlessly into the woods, completely isolated from most forms of civilization. It was broken down and poorly cared for, looking like it had been abandoned for much longer than the few days it had been since my grandmother's death. Upon nearing the half-rotted through front door, the lawyer handed me a spare handkerchief he had pulled out of his pocket. He was already covering his own mouth and nose with one of a similar design, and recommended I do the same. I listened, of course, wondering what I'd managed to get myself into. The inside of the house looked more like a junkyard than a home. If you've ever seen one of those reality TV shows about hoarders, imagine one of those houses, the worst one you can conjure from memory, and multiply the filth at least 10 times. I wouldn't call myself particularly neat, and I certainly don't mind a little bit of clutter. However, I feel that the sheer magnitude of the garbage contained within this home would have put even the worst hoarder off. I felt that every moment spent in that foul home was taking minutes off of my life. I thought that the smell my grandmother had carried during the funeral was bad, but after visiting the slag pit that had birthed that odor, it seemed like fresh linen and daisies in comparison. There wasn't any sort of rhyme or reason to any of the items contained within. There was nothing in the way of organisation, and most things just seemed to be straight up garbage in every sense of the word. Half of the first room we entered, the kitchen, was actually dominated by a steadily rotting pile of what appeared to be food remains, while the rest of it was piled up with things like newspapers, old broken clocks, and what appeared to be a stack of twigs from the yard. There was no apparent care for any of the items, and nothing suggesting any sort of theme to her collection. It was as if she had simply treated the house as a whole as a garbage can. Clearly, her mental condition had only worsened over the years. I was nearly certain at a glance that there would be nothing here that Dad could ever want, but the lawyer had already forged the path ahead through the piles. Sighing a bit, I followed him in, having decided to at least try not to make this trip a complete waste of time. Perhaps there were indeed some diamonds in the rough to be found. As I followed him, we came upon a slightly widened path through the heaps that we could walk on somewhat comfortably without having to worry about slipping on a rotten banana peel and falling into a pile of dirty old clothes and half-empty milk jugs. We followed the path further into the home until we came to the living room. There was a suspicious-looking clear space in the middle of the room, as well as traces of something large having been dragged directly through the mess into the nearby back door. Examining the clear space in more detail, I found that you could even tell from it that the original colour of the carpet was white instead of a murky brown. Noticing my gaze, the lawyer felt the need to let me know that the space was actually where my grandmother had died. Apparently, she had passed in her armchair and had practically fused to it by the time she was discovered. Firemen had to drag the whole thing out the back door before they could cut her loose and bag up the body. I gave the man a disgusted look for the unwanted information, but he simply shrugged it off. Glancing at one of the piles that had been split open while removing the armchair and finding that, if you went deep enough, eventually it just turned into a sort of black goo. I decided I was just going to give the place a quick once-over and get out as soon as possible. I looked about the place, going into one of the few rooms I could actually manage to enter. It had been so long since many of them had actually been used, that most of them were simply filled with stuff and used as storage. The theme of lacking any sort of theme was continued here, and I had nothing to go off of to determine what any of the rooms had been originally used for, let alone which one used to be Dad's bedroom. That is, excluding the bathroom. I could tell which room that was from a mile away by the smell alone. That, and the suspicious-looking stains that surrounded the base of the door, seeping out into the carpet around it. I certainly had no intention of breaking the seal on whatever was contained behind that door. I gave up rather quickly. I didn't see much of anything of any value during my search, and anything I did find that could have been worth something was in such a state that it wasn't worth the time required to lug it out of there. Returning to the living room, I found the lawyer glancing about the room, seemingly confused and occasionally looking back to a sheaf of papers on his hands. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that, apparently, there was supposed to be a basement in the house, but he couldn't find the entrance to it anywhere. Intrigued by this, I joined him in his search. Eventually, upon closer inspection, we found the door to the basement in the kitchen, the edge of its frame just barely hidden behind the terrarium that only slightly still resembled a fridge. It seemed more than a little suspicious, the door being hidden like that, and I was a bit wary of actually finding out what was behind the door. After seeing the rest of the house, I was certain it couldn't be good. However, whether I went down or not, the lawyer apparently had to go down there to inspect some meters or something before he could legally start to try and get rid of the trash heap of the house. In the end, curiosity got the better of me, and after helping the lawyer shift the sticky hunk of machinery blocking it, I followed him through the door as we descended into the basement. It was dark, the electricity having been shut off long ago, but the lawyer had thankfully thought to bring a flashlight. As the beam of light lit up the old wooden stairs, the first thing that struck me was how clean it was. A little dusty, sure, but compared to the rest of the house, it was practically sterile. We made our way down the stairs slowly, trying to put as little weight as possible onto the creaky boards for fear of them splintering. Eventually, we reached the bottom, finding something odd sitting at the foot of the stairs. A slightly rusty, old toy train. I picked it up and gave it a curious once-over, wondering if it had belonged to my dad. Still holding the little toy train, I followed the beam of light cast from the flashlight with my eyes as the lawyer swept it across the room. The basement was strange, to say the least. The floors and walls were all covered with multicolour foam padding, much like a children's playroom. Various toys were scattered about, most of them old and worn, but still in decent condition. There were windows at the top of the walls that had originally led to the surface, but they seemed to have been intentionally buried at some point. I briefly wondered if this was where Dad used to play. But then, the beam of light focused on something different. Something that made my blood run cold at the sight of it. A heavy, rusty chain, fastened directly to the concrete wall in between two sections of padding. The beam froze on this for a moment, the lawyer shocked by what we had discovered as well. He let out a singular "oh" as he shuddered, the beam shaking slightly. He then followed the chain downwards as it trailed down the wall and snaked around the room, eventually disappearing under the stairs we had just come down. He focused the beam there. "Oh God, no," the lawyer said. I didn't stick around long, opting to quickly rush up the stairs and out of the house. I hunched over in the front lawn, breathing heavily in panic. I didn't see much, but I saw enough for it to haunt me for the rest of my life. A shackle, a skeletal ankle, far too small to be an adult. A bony foot ending in rough, gnawed-off stubs where toes used to be. I thought of black, rotten teeth, smiling viciously at me from across the room, and emptied the contents of my stomach onto the lawn. After an investigation, they are able to match the dental records to a 14-year-old that had gone missing 5 years prior in the next town over. When I was in school growing up, I always sat next to the quiet kid, Andy. It just happened that his last name was Winfrey, and my last name was Zemba, so we always sat next to each other. This worked out pretty well, because Ma always said I could talk to a brick wall, and Andy was the human equivalent of talking to a brick wall. Andy wasn't your typical quiet kid. In fact, he never talked at all. Ever. I'm pretty sure that he could talk, but he just chose not to. If you tried to talk to him, he would just stare blankly at you until you went away. If the teachers called on him to read, as every teacher tried, he would just ignore their request and go about doing his own thing. Eventually, everyone just accepted that he didn't talk. That was just Andy. At first, people thought there was something wrong with Andy. They suspected that maybe he was deaf and mute. That would explain why he couldn't talk. But he could hear you just fine, and he never even tried to communicate using sign language or even writing down what he wanted, when he clearly could write. It was a decision Andy had made not to talk. Andy was smart. He was easily the smartest kid in our grade, probably the entire school. Most people are surprised when they find this out because if you ever have been in the same class as Andy, you know he never paid any lick of attention to anything the teachers was trying to teach. Because of this, the other kids, and even adults, nicknamed him Rain Man. You know, after the movie. I always thought that was pretty mean, even if it was somewhat fitting. In elementary school, he would sit at his desk and draw pictures or read all day long, ignoring everyone. But I don't think he ever missed a question on any test. The teacher could call him up to the board to answer any question, and it was always correct. Some teachers even made a game of trying to stump him, but he won every time. It didn't change in middle school. He would sit and listen to a portable CD player every day during class and pass every class with straight A's. Sometimes I wondered why he even showed up at school to begin with, since he was so much smarter than everyone else. I don't know if I would call Andy my friend growing up, but I think Andy saw me as his friend. Not the same type of friend you and I may be, but the sort of friend Andy would have. I mean, we sat by each other because of our last names, and I would talk to him about the X-Men since he wore some of their shirts from time to time. Andy would sit at our lunch table and listen to me and my friends talk about girls or the new superheroes movie. He would sometimes smile and nod, and sometimes we would trade CDs for a few days. It always made me laugh that a guy who never made a sound was into heavy metal. I guess in a weird way, Andy and I were friends. Andy also had a secret ability. I am pretty sure I am the only one who ever caught him, and I never told anybody. Andy had the power to move things with his mind. He was usually cautious enough to keep his talent hidden, but sometimes he got careless or bored. I'll never forget the first time I caught him. I was in 4th grade, sitting next to him in the back of the class. As usual, he was not paying attention and doing his own thing. In the corner of my eye, I saw his pencil spinning in a circle on his desk. I moved my eyes over without actually turning my head, and I could see him twirling his fingers about 3 inches above his pencil, and the pencil followed his finger's motion. Then he stopped his finger and started twirling it the other way, and the pencil followed. Another time, he was reading a book during class, and I would see the pages turn without him actually having to turn it. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, but it happened enough times I could tell it was Andy. He eventually noticed that I'd caught him. He looked surprised at first, but then gave me a little smile and held his finger to his mouth as to say, "Don't tell my secret." And I never did. Once I knew he had this ability, I was able to notice it from time to time. Andy went out of his way to make sure he hid this talent and rarely used it around people. But if someone upset him, he would lose control. Even on those occasions when he was upset, he was still very good with disguising it to look like a random accident. It always made me wonder just exactly what Andy was capable of if he lost control. For instance, in 5th grade, we were out playing football at recess. Even though Andy didn't talk, he loved to play sports and loved recess. You'd never expect him, of all people, to be so competitive. The other team kept cheating by continuing to play after they were downed by Andy, but since Andy didn't talk or argue, they got away with it. It happened over and over, and Andy was mad. When we got the ball back, Andy, who was playing quarterback, He would clap to have the ball hiked. He could communicate when he wanted to. And threw what should have been an easy interception right to the boy who had been cheating. Somehow the boy's hands didn't close and the ball drilled him right in the face, breaking his nose. As the kid sat on the ground, crying in a pool of his own blood, Andy looked over to me and gave me a wink. Another time, we had a substitute teacher for a few weeks while ours was out on maternity leave in middle school. This teacher hated our class, and especially hated Andy. She didn't like that he was allowed to just sit in the back and listen to music while she was teaching. She had never seen any student so disrespectful and allowed to get away with it. She took his CD player away. The next day, after lunch, the teacher returned with a fresh afternoon coffee. As she went to take a drink, she accidentally misjudged and poured the entire cup of steaming hot coffee all over her chest and stomach. She screamed in pain and had to get taken to the hospital and treated for second-degree burns. She never returned to class again. Andy had his CD player back the next day and everything was back to normal. This brings us to high school. As you might expect, Andy had a reputation. Everyone knows about Andy. I think the whole town probably knew about Andy. When you're different in high school, you attract attention. A lot of times, that attention is unwanted attention. Even though Andy never said or did anything to anybody, he still became a target. Some of the upperclassmen decided to make a game to see who could make Andy talk first. The person who could make him say even one word would get $100. They tried everything they could think of. They tried being his friend, telling him jokes. Girls even offered to date him and even sleep with him if he would just say yes. But he never said a word. As time went on, their tactics changed. Instead of taking a friendly approach, they decided they would take the opposite approach and pick on him relentlessly to make him crack. Having a locker next to him, I witnessed a lot of the abuse he went through. And it was abuse. They tried everything from calling him names, pushing him into lockers, trying to embarrass him, and just bullying him in every way they could think of. You get the picture. Still, Andy never broke. He never said a word. He would get visibly upset, red-faced, deep-breathing, but he never said a word. It got so bad at times that I tried to step in for him and talk for him, but that just made them start to bully us both. One Friday, things went too far. 3 of the worst offenders pushed him into his locker again. Andy finally had enough and pushed them back. A fight started. It was 3-on-1, 3 juniors football players versus the freshman Andy. Andy wasn't even big for his age, and he never stood a chance. There wasn't much Andy could do, except try to shield himself from being repeatedly kicked in the head while he was down. It didn't last long before he got broken up, but Andy was hurt. His nose looked broken, and his face was a crimson mask. To his credit, even when the police came and asked for a statement to arrest those kids, he didn't talk. The 3 juniors were arrested for assault and suspended for a week. The cameras had caught everything they needed to press charges, and there were enough witnesses even without Andy giving a statement. When we came back from school the following Monday, they made everyone report to their homeroom before school started. This was not normal, but occasionally it would happen. So I took my seat in the back next to Andy. Then they made the morning announcements. On Saturday night, 3 students had tragically died in separate house fires over the weekend. Counsellors would be available all week for anybody who needed to see them. It was the same 3 boys who had attacked Andy that died in the house fires. I leaned over to Andy and said, "I guess they won't be bothering you anymore." He glanced back at me, still smiling, and in a low, deep voice, so quiet that I was the only one who could just about hear it. He said, "I know." There was an investigation, and all 3 fires were caused by an electrical fire that had started in the boys' room. All 3 of the boys were found to be burned alive, trying to escape out of their bedroom door, which were found to not have been locked, but still had to be broken open by the firefighters unseen. It was just an eerie coincidence that the fires all happened on the same night, at the same time, and killed 3 boys who were in the same grade. 2 weeks later, Andy's parents pulled him from school, and the teacher said his family were moving due to a new job. I've tried to find him on social media, but I'm not surprised the boy who never talked doesn't have a Facebook account. In the entire time I knew him, those were the only words I ever heard him speak. I swear, on the highest honor I can muster, that everything in this story is true, related as lucidly as possible. All true, no matter how badly I wish it wasn't. There isn't much to do in the rural parts of Pennsylvania, what some call Pennsyltucky. Like most parts of rural America, popular pastimes include drinking oneself into a stupor and driving unexpectedly 1983 Ford F-150s, double the speed limit down narrow, rarely maintained roads. I, however, occupy myself, when I can, by hunting. It gets a bad rap as a barbaric, cruel practice, but I've always found solace in the forest that is impossible to find in the cramped, too close for comfort atmosphere of a small town. This particular season, I was out in early November in a forest in the foothills of the Appalachians, a few minutes away from my home northwest of Harrisburg. It was late in the fall season, and the steady flow of foliage tourists, what locals call leaf peepers, was beginning to trickle to a stop. Some trees were still burning a fiery red-orange, but most were beginning to wither, foreshadowing an unusually harsh winter. The falling leaves created a curtain of decay which moved like a sandstorm in slow motion, shrouding and isolating me from my surroundings and crunching softly under every footstep. I paced my way through the temple of red and gold, alert for the light footsteps of my quarry, white-tailed deer. My Winchester .30-06 swayed on my back as I walked. The gun was overkill for a deer, but it doesn't pay to take chances around bigger game like elk and black bear. This forest was new territory for me, a refreshing change of pace after paved trails and subdivisions began to encircle the hunting grounds of my childhood. As I walked, I began to lighten my guard, losing focus on the wildlife and becoming engrossed in the natural beauty of the area. I became so distracted, peering up at the falling leaves, that I tripped over a tree root snaking through the carpet. I followed it with my eye to its termination at the base of a massive, gnarled oak tree. The trunk was huge, but the tree was squat, blackened with age, and split down the middle as if by an act of God. This story could have ended then and there, if not for a smell that wafted up to me as I passed the tree. It wound its way up from the tree's base, out of a swale in the ground, to the raised path I was walking on, pushing the crisp smell of the forest aside. My first thought was that of a dead animal, which could mean a bear in the area, so I circled the tree to take a look. There was no carcass, but the scene at the base of the tree resembled a homicide. Dark, matted clumps of fur dotted the undergrowth, and a viscous black fluid led from the forest into a hollow overshadowed by a titanic root leading deep into the ground. The entire picture was punctuated by the small rank smell, a thick, coppery scent like pennies mixed with death. I am not unused to gritty, even downright disturbing scenes, but this scent made me retch involuntarily, and the den unsettled me deeply, as though I had stumbled upon something no one should ever see. Shaken, I moved back onto the trail and, against my better judgment, resumed my search for a deer. The sun began to beat down overhead with all the clarity of a winter's day, shining a demanding light under the forest and weakening my resolve. I had just begun to unpack my lunch when something began to bother me. I couldn't put a finger on what it was, but I felt antsy, for lack of a better word, like I shouldn't be sitting still. Without even knowing it, I began to scan my surroundings for something, anything. I was returning to my lunch when it hit me. The forest was silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Even the rustle of trees in the wind had come to an ominous standstill. As the meaning of this realization began to sink in and I got to my feet, two things happened in rapid succession. A sizable branch snapped a few hundred meters away, and an ungodly screech penetrated the November air. I have never heard a sound like it before or since. It was as though the earth itself split and hell opened up, just long enough to sum up the suffering of the damned in one ear-splitting roar. Terrified, I bolted to my gun, leaned against the tree, and began to scan the undergrowth. Something big was moving through the forest floor, but I couldn't see what it was thanks to the curtain of leaves falling around me. I hastily made tracks back in the direction I had come, forcing myself not to look back. After all, what animal would actively stalk a human without even being provoked? I had lost the sound of the creature and began to loosen up a little when I was hit with a bone-chilling realization. The sounds of the forest had come back behind me, but the trees in front were as silent of the grave. Whatever I had encountered, probably the same beast that had made the mess under the oak tree, had circled back in an attempt to trap me. Truly scared at this point, I scrambled off the path into a rock gully, my back to a damp rock wall. I crawled without taking my eyes off the path into a cave, hoping to hide my hyperventilation and chattering teeth from whatever was stalking me. Only a few minutes had passed when I heard the crunch of leaves and a deep, demonic snorting. It stopped on the path above my hideaway, and I held my breath, willing my heart to stop so as to be completely silent. The creature had begun to move on when my gun, leaning against the rock, slipped off the slick surface. It clattered to the ground, reverberating louder than an air raid siren in the crisp autumn air. My heart sank as I heard steps make their way down the rocks and closer to me. I crawled painfully slowly towards my rifle, every muscle in my body tight enough to burst. I stopped to steady myself and heard breathing right outside the cave opening. It was choked, slavering breathing, unnatural breathing, which inspired visualizations of twisted corruptions of human and beast, a patchwork demon of animal and man. I reached for my gun and came the closest to death I ever have. Because I outstretched my hand, so did it. Instead of the smooth shellac of my rifle stock, my palm met a coarse, ragged fur, caked with mud and attached to a lanky, sinewy arm. The beast screamed, and as I shouldered my rifle and fired blindly out of the opening, I caught a glimpse of yellowed fang and one blood-red eye, an eye that reflected a hatred more ancient than man, a hatred that said, "This is my forest. You may have altered it through your presence, corrupted it, but I was here before you, and I will be here after." Human willpower paled in the face of such uncompromising malice, and I shrank back against the rocks, robotically cycling bullets out of the cave. I sat there, dead-eyed, doing this for a long time, overnight and well into the next morning, over 18 hours of working a bolt and pulling the trigger. By the time I snapped out of my adrenaline-fueled haze, my mouth felt like a desert, and my fingers felt as though they were made out of canvas stretched over dust. Shaking, I reached for my water bottle and gulped it down, spilling most of it down my front. Praying the beast was long gone, I inched my way out of the cave and ran as fast as my rickety legs would carry me the 2 odd miles back to my truck, leaving most of my gear behind. Nothing pursued me, but the feeling of being hunted remained. I drove back to town 80 miles per hour on a dirt road, my eyes wide with fear and my hands gripping the wheel with white knuckles. Unable to bear the thoughts of my secluded home, I spent the night at a motel in town with a bottle of cheap whiskey and every light in the room turned on. The thought of the creature would not exit my mind. Was it a demon, loosed on the earth by some divine mistake? Or just an animal, a cryptid lost to time and the memories of the trees? I didn't really want to know, but I couldn't, and still can't, let it go. The fear eventually subsided, but as I sit at home, thinking about this, I swear, hand to God, that I can hear a howl echo through the trees and across the mountains, telling me that I may never rest, never forget.